Last section, you learned how to multiply and divide fractions by whole numbers. This section is going to teach us specifically how to multiply fractions by other fractions. Now, I want you to know that there is a very short algorithm that you will see at the end of this section. We're going to emphasize drawing the fractions correctly and understanding the process first. I really enjoy this section because if you brought some of this homework home tonight and asked your parents to draw what a half times a half means, they probably wouldn't be able to do that, even though they could probably tell you what the answer to the problem is, which is one of the reasons why I really enjoy teaching fractions. So we're going to talk real quick about what does a half times a half mean. Now, let's imagine for a second that this is a candy bar. Okay, and I brought in the candy bar and I add half of it to start, okay, which I drew in a picture right here. If I want a half times a half, the word of is the same thing as multiplication. Therefore, what this problem is actually asking us to do is take half of a half. Well, the example in the problem with half of the candy bar would say, I brought in half of the candy bar to class, and I wanted to split that half between me and Mrs. A. Okay? Well, if I wanted to take this half of the candy bar and I wanted to split it in half, that means I'm going to split it into two equal pieces, and I am going to take one of the pieces. That piece goes to me, and then Mrs. A, she's going to get one of the pieces right there. And now we each have a half of the half. The problem here is that we do not know how big this fraction is because we have not made the whole fraction the same size or every piece of the fraction the same size. Therefore, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece here and I cut this in half. I'm also going to cut this piece in half as well, which means that Mr. Schmidt got 1/4 of the candy bar, and Mrs. A got 1/4 of the candy bar. Therefore, a half of a half is equal to 1/4. Okay, so when we start talking about multiplication, what I want you to always think about is it's the word of. Okay, so it's a half of a half. Let's start to get a little bit more difficult. Okay, so the problem we have here is a half times 2/3, which means a half of 2/3. I wrote that right over here. Now, if we're looking for a half of 2/3, the first thing I wanted to do is I wanted to take my 2/3 and I wanted to draw it in a picture. Now, if I want to know a half of it, the easiest way to do that is to take each piece and split them in a half, okay? So I want to take that and split it in half, take that and split it in half, take that and split it in half. Okay, so I take this piece right here, and I cut it right there. I take this piece right here, I cut it there, and I take this piece right here and I cut it. And so what I did is I made 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces total. So I turned my thirds into sixths. But I wanted to take a half of this piece, which means that I shade in 1/2 of this chunk. So I shaded one of the two, okay? But not this one. Then in this piece right here, I want to shade in 1/2. So one of the two, but not both. And then I go to the last piece and I want to shade in half, but I want to shade in half of nothing. Therefore, I stay with nothing. So that means that I had 4/6, but I took a half of them and it became 2/6. Okay, now going back in this section, because both 2 and 6 can be divided by 2, that means my answer here is actually 1/3. And I told you in this section that there's a very fast algorithm, but we're emphasizing on the actual process of the picture. Okay, we will do the algorithm, I absolutely promise, but I want you to understand what it means. Now, if we look at this picture here, the most important thing is if both of these numbers are less than 1, and they are, you absolutely should have less than what you started with. Okay, if you have half of something you should have less after you take away half of it. Okay, so your number should never get bigger when you're done. Now here's the big question though. We had a half times 2/3, and that meant a half of 2/3. What if we did it in reverse? What if we took a half of 2/3? We're like, but I wanted to draw a half first. So I'm going to do 2/3 of 1/2. Am I still going to get the same answer? Okay, so that's a really good question. So that means I'm going to go down to this problem, and I have a half and I have a half. So I'm going to do 2/3 of this part, and I'm going to do 2/3 of this part. Okay? So I take this piece, and I'm going to cut them into equal thirds. I'm going to take this piece over here, and I'm also going to cut it into equal thirds. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I still have 6, but I need to do my shading. Well, this one means I want to shade 2 of the 3 groups. So I'm going to shade 2. So there you go. I got 2 of the 3 groups shaded in there. And this one I want to shade 2 of the 3, but I didn't start with anything. So 2/3 of 0 is still just 0. So there's no shading that happens here. Which means that once again I get 1, 2, 6. So that means I get 1/3 again. And therefore 1/2 times 2/3 is equal to 2/6 or 1/3. Which means that if I did 1/2 times 2/3 or 2/3 times 1/2, that means that they are the same problem. That means multiplication is commutative. So if you come up to Mr. Schmidt in class and say multiplication is commutative, you can earn either 5 SPs or 1 piece of candy. Small candy specifically. Okay? Let's do 2 more problems together. Okay? So for this one, we have 3/4 times 2/3. Once again, this means of right here. Now, I know I can start with either 3/4 or 2/3. I personally am going to start with 3/4. And there's not really a reason for that. I just like drawing fourths because I know that I can start with halves and then cut each half in half. So it's not really a reason for it, but I just think it's easier. Okay, so I'm going to do 1, 2, 3 fourths. Okay, so then I'm going to take each of my fourths and I'm going to shade 2/3 of it. So that means I'm going to cut each of these pieces into 3 equal parts, and then I'm going to shade 2 of those 3. Okay, so there's second, third, and final one. Okay, so one of the other ways to kind of trick the shading here is I'll show you. Okay, so of these 2, I'm going to go 1, 2 are shaded. This one I'm going to go 3, 4. This last one I'm going to go 5, 6. And then this, since I started with nothing, I'm not going to shade anything. So that means I have 6 of my total, 3, 6, 9, 12. So I ended up shading a total of 6/12. So 3/4 times 2/3 is equal to 6/12. But I am not in simplest form. I know that if I did both of these divided by 2, that would give me 3/6. But I can then simplify again by dividing by 3, which ends up giving me 1/2. So 3/4 of 2/3 is equal to a half. Once again, because both of these numbers are less than 1, my answer had to be smaller than both of these fractions. And that is honestly as tough as the picture will ever get. If you can draw that picture, you can draw anything. I want you to try this one on your own, and then I'm going to work through it afterwards. Once again, since multiplication means of, I can start with either fraction. Now this one doesn't really matter which fraction you start with because they're both thirds. So I am going to start with 2/3 over here, but it does not matter because multiplication is commutative. So I have 2/3. So I'm going to put an X just to try something a little bit different. That's what you start doing as you get more comfortable. So this is 2/3, whoops, right there. And then I'm going to do 1/3 of each of these pieces. Okay? So, in order to do 1/3, I need to cut up each piece into 3 equal parts, and then I'm going to shade one of those 3. All right. And then I'm going to shade in 1/3. And then I'm going to shade in 1/3. And then this is 0 to begin with, so I don't shade anything in there. And I am left with 2/9. And since nothing can divide evenly into 2 and 9 at the same time, that means 2 and 9 are relatively prime to each other. That means my answer of 1/3 times 2/3 is 2/9.